The name was Ruston, not Hepburn. That is where the story should have begun, and it is where almost none of them do. Every biography places her in the same opening frame. Brussels, 1929. A Dutch baroness, an English banker, a girl born on the 4th of May who would become, in the formal estimation of the American Film Institute, the third greatest female screen legend in cinema history. She wore Givenchy before the world had learned how to pronounce it. She survived a wartime famine by grinding tulip bulbs into flour. She traveled to Somalia and Bangladesh and Ethiopia in the last years of her life, and when she spoke about hunger, she spoke from memory, not from sympathy. The story of Audrey Hepburn has been told so often and with such apparent completeness that it seems, by now, a closed document. It is not. In recent years, researchers working in genealogical archives in Britain and in Central Europe trace the paternal line of the Ruston family backward through Bohemia into records held at the Czech National Archive and the Jewish Museum of Prague. What they found does not diminish what Audrey Hepburn built. Nothing in this story has the power to do that, but it does complicate the name she carried and illuminate the one she never knew she had. They are living descendants of Audrey Hepburn. This is not a story intended to speak for them or to disturb what they carry. It is a story about the world their grandmother moved through. Hold one name in mind as this unfolds: Johann Anton Wedeles. It will matter. It will matter more than any other name in the story. Stay with this. The record is older and stranger than the biography. The accepted version of Audrey Hepburn's origins has always been presented as settled. She was born in the Brussels municipality of Ixelles on the 4th of May, 1929. Her mother was Baroness Ella van Heemstra, a Dutch noblewoman whose father, Baron Arnoud van Heemstra, had served as mayor of Arnhem for 10 years and twice as royal governor of Suriname. This side of the family was traceable and thoroughly documented. The Van Heemstras were Frisian in origin, a lineage formally recognized by the Dutch nobility register from 1814 onward.
She met
Ella's
William
ancestry
Holden.
was, by every
Holden
measure,
was already
exactly
a major
what it
Hollywood
claimed to
star.
be. Her father's ancestry was another matter. Joseph Victor Anthony Ruston was born in 1889 in Uzes, in the Bohemian region of what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a businessman and insurance agent who served briefly as honorary British consul in the port city of Semarang in the Dutch East Indies. He was also, in the years before the Second World War, a card-carrying member of the British Union of Fascists under Sir Oswald Mosley. His wife attended the Nuremberg rally in 1935 and wrote admiringly of Adolf Hitler for the fascist newspaper The Black Shirt. Ruston himself was alleged, in proceedings before the Belgian Parliament, to have received more than £110,000 from associates of Joseph Goebbels to fund a pro-Nazi publication. The British government imprisoned him in 1940 under Defense Regulation 18B as an enemy of the state. Before his imprisonment, he had made one significant alteration to the family name. He added Hepburn, creating the double-barreled surname Hepburn-Ruston. His claim was that his maternal grandmother, Kathleen Hepburn, descended from James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell, the Scottish nobleman who had married Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1567. This genealogical claim is the foundation on which the most recognizable name in cinema was built. No document has ever confirmed it. Genealogical researchers examining the specific descent from Kathleen Hepburn to the Earl of Bothwell have found nothing on record, not a disproved connection, not a demonstrated error, simply no supporting document of any kind. The aristocratic surname that Audrey carried through every film and every UNICEF mission and every photograph existed because one man believed something he could not prove. That is the first crack. It is quiet, but it opens into something deeper. The question of what else in the Ruston line was not what it appeared. Georgina Sturge was not researching Audrey Hepburn's ancestry. She was writing a book about Britain's long relationship with its own data, a history assembled from registers and censuses and demographic records of how the British state had measured and categorized its population across the centuries. While working through the National Register of 1939, a civilian census compiled on the 29th of September that year, 2 weeks after Britain's declaration of war, she began thinking about notable people who might appear in its pages. She found Alan Turing. She found a few others. Then she thought of Audrey Hepburn, who had been a child in England at exactly the moment the register was compiled. Sturge contacted David Annell, a genealogist at Lifeline's Research. Annell located the relevant household, a property called Orchard Villa in the village of Elm, Kent, belonging to a family named Butcher. The record was redacted, as all entries containing the dates of birth of potentially living persons were sealed. But the birth date inside the sealed entry aligned precisely with Hepburn's. Sturge and Annell contacted FindMePass, the genealogical platform that holds access to the National Archives holdings, and requested the record be opened. It was. The unsealed entry listed name Audrey K. Hepburn Ruston. Date of birth 4th of May, 1929. The child who would become Audrey Hepburn had been living in a small English village at the edge of the war, lodge of family whose name is now more legible than the mystery of the surname she was listed under. What the record confirmed, beyond the fact of her wartime English childhood, was a naming architecture underneath the famous double barrel. Hepburn Ruston had been assembled only in the late 1930s. Before that, the family was simply Ruston, and Ruston had been the family name for exactly 2 generations. Before the Rustons came to that name, the paternal line ran not to England, not to Scotland, not to any territory the aristocratic mythology implied, but backward into Bohemia, and through Bohemia, into the records of a community whose very naming conventions told a very particular kind of story. The Ruston line ended in Prague. Genealogical researchers cross-referencing Czech archival sources traced Audrey's paternal grandmother, Anna Juliana Francisca Wels, to the shortened surname back to her father, a man whose name, before his compression into that Germanic monosyllable, had been Johann Anton Wedeles. The name this whole story was waiting for. It was there all along in the record. The surname Wedeles is not obscure in the genealogical literature of Prague's Jewish community. It belongs to a recognized class of surnames, carrying the distinctive suffix "els", that were characteristic of the Ashkenazi Jewish population of Prague from the 17th century onward. Abels, Gidels, Karpeles, Paschals, Wedeles. These names appear with significant concentration throughout the records compiled by Prague's Joseph Quarter, in no other European community at the same density. They emerge from within that specific population. Researchers working on the reconstruction of Prague's Jewish genealogical record, the Jewish Families from Prague Project, drawing on the Czech National Archive collection of more than 3,000 volumes of Jewish birth, marriage, and death registers, have documented these surnames across multiple centuries, identifying the families that carried them and the generations through which they passed. The documented line connecting Audrey Hepburn to those records runs through 4 generations and 3 name changes. Anna Juliana Francisca Wels, Audrey's paternal grandmother, was born in Kovars, in what is now Western Slovakia. Her father's name had been Wedeles before its compression into Wels. His parents were Nathan Wedeles and Judith Julie Porges, both from documented Ashkenazi Jewish families with traceable histories in Prague. The Porges name appears across centuries of that community's records. The Wedeles name is similarly present. Johann Anton's shortening of his family name to Wels followed a pattern so precisely documented in academic research on Bohemian Jewish assimilation that the researchers who identified it describe it not as an anomaly, but as a near-perfect illustration of a process repeated across hundreds of Central European families in the 19th century. Here the counter-argument must be stated honestly. This is a legitimate challenge. It cannot be dismissed. The genealogical databases that underpin this finding, however carefully cross-referenced against primary sources, are not equivalent to peer-reviewed genetic analysis performed on biological material. No DNA sample from Audrey Hepburn's remains has been tested against Ashkenazi reference populations. The documentary chain of evidence is compelling and has been assembled by multiple independent researchers converging on the same conclusion, but it is genealogical evidence, not a confirmed biological result. The research teams have acknowledged this directly. What they assert is the archival record. The distinction matters, but what the archival record shows is not ambiguous. Nathan Wedeles and Judith Julie Porges were documented Ashkenazi Jews of Prague. Their great-granddaughter became Audrey Hepburn. This is where the 2 tracks meet. The first track was documentary. The archival chain traced by genealogical researchers, connecting Anna Wels to Johann Wedeles to Nathan Wedeles and Judith Porges in the Jewish registers of Prague. The second track is the naming pattern, an independent form of evidence that was not produced by the documentary research. It simply confirms what the archive already showed through an entirely separate line of inquiry. Academic researchers working on the history of Jewish surnames in Bohemia have documented a specific and recurring pattern in the decades following Emperor Joseph II's Jewish name law of 1787, which required all Jews in the Habsburg Empire to adopt fixed, hereditary German-language surnames. The pressure behind these name changes was not only legal, it was structural. Jewish families navigating the Familientan law, which from 1726 onward had restricted the marriage rights of all but the eldest sons of registered Jewish families in Bohemia, had powerful reasons to reduce their genealogical visibility. A surname ending in Els announced its origins to any informed reader. A surname like Wels announced nothing. The academic literature on Bohemian Jewish naming practices identifies this exact compression as a systematic phenomenon, occurring across dozens of families across precisely the period when the Wedeles name became Wels. The genealogists who traced Anna Wels to Johann Wedeles, and the academic scholars who documented the Bohemian naming compression pattern were working independently. Neither team was building from the other's conclusion. Both arrived at the same place. There is one more layer, and it is the one that carries the most weight. The man who inherited that suppressed lineage, Joseph Victor Anthony Ruston, born Bohemian, registered British, great-great-grandson of Nathan Wedeles, became a fascist propagandist. He praised Adolf Hitler in print. Under the racial classification laws he publicly supported, his own great-grandfather would have been classified for deportation and extermination. His daughter read in Frank's diary in the late 1940s. She said it felt like her own story. She said she understood, and from the inside, in a way she could not fully articulate. She called in Frank her soul sister and carried that identification until the last year of her life. She never publicly explained where it came from. The archive now contains a possible answer, not a verdict. Simply the trace of a question she may never have known to ask. The concealment did not begin with Joseph Ruston. It began with a law, the Gedempedent, issued by Emperor Joseph II in 1787, required all Jews in the Habsburg Empire to adopt fixed, hereditary German-language surnames. Before that decree, Jewish families in Bohemia had used patronymic naming systems, names that changed every generation, following the father's given name, leaving no fixed surname to trace across the centuries. The law formalized surnames, but the surnames it formalized were German, not Hebrew, not Yiddish. The linguistic content of the naming system was replaced. What had announced its origins was made, generation by generation, to sound like something else. The Familientan law had preceded even this. Enacted in 1726 and enforced until 1849, it regulated the existence of Jewish family life in Bohemia by limiting who was legally permitted to marry. Only the firstborn son of a registered Jewish family held that right. Younger sons could wait for a registered family number to become available, which happened only through death, or they could leave. This law produced exactly the dispersal visible in the Wedeles-Wels genealogical record. Departure from Prague, movement into smaller towns and neighboring regions of the empire, into communities where Jewish identity was less visible and less policed, where the next generation could take a shorter name and step, incrementally, into the general population and not look back. Audrey Hepburn's case is not unique in its structure. It is unique only in the name attached to it. The 19th and early 20th centuries produced hundreds of thousands of documented cases across Central Europe in which Ashkenazi Jewish families, across 2 or 3 generations of assimilation, intermarriage, and name change, became genealogically invisible to their own descendants. The genealogical literature calls this population Jews by descent, those who carry the ancestry without carrying the knowledge. It was not a secret kept by one person. It was a silence sustained by a structure, by laws that had made Jewish identity economically and socially unsustainable across generations. There are people alive today who carry the same inheritance without knowing it. The Bohemian Jewish community, from which 78,000 of 92,000 people were murdered between 1939 and 1945, left its survivors exactly where sustained structural pressure leaves all populations, absorbed into the surrounding world. Carrying names that no longer said what they once meant, their origins visible only to those who knew where to look. The The Wedeles family was one thread in that larger silence. Audrey Hepburn, unknowingly, carried it forward. In January 2024, the National Archives opened a record that had been sealed since September 1939, a piece of wartime paperwork, a census entry for a household in Elm, Kent. The unsealed document listed a name, Audrey K. Hepburn Ruston, a borrowed name, a name assembled from a genealogical claim that no document has supported, a name that covered the name Ruston, which covered the compressed name Wels, which covered the name Wedeles, which arrived at its documented end at Nathan Wedeles and Judah Julie Porges in the Jewish registers of Prague. There are people who will say this changes nothing about what Audrey Hepburn meant. They are right. Roman holiday belongs to her. Holly Golightly belongs to her. The 52 UNICEF field missions to Sudan, to Somalia, to Bangladesh, to Guatemala, those belong to her, and to the children who were still alive because she came. The humanitarian life she built in her final decade was not an extension of the public image. It was a thing she chose when the work of being famous was finished. No genealogical record reaches that life. It has no standing to. But the question the archive raises is one the science cannot answer. Did she know? Her father lived until 1980. She outlived him by 13 years. In those final decades, there was occasional contact between them, careful, bounded, shadowed by what he had been. Whether the name Wedeles was ever spoken between them, whether Joseph Ruston himself understood the full depth of what it buried, whether he told his daughter anything of what lay beneath the name he had borrowed from an unverifiable Scottish earl, this exists in no document that has been found. It is in the silence underneath all the documents, the same silence that sits beneath the Familianton records and the compressed surnames and the family lines that stepped quietly out of their own history in 19th century Bohemia and did not look back. What is known is this. A woman who may have carried that lineage without knowing it read the diary of a Jewish girl hiding in Amsterdam and said it was her own story, said she felt it from somewhere she could not name. The 1939 register is still there. The name on the form is Hepburn Ruston. The name beneath it is Wedeles. The other one was hers to find.